Hello everyone, this is Coach B with masteryourchess.com. In this video we're going to go over Rook Endgames where we have a pawn on the 7th rank. In an earlier video I've talked about the Lucena position, and that's when the stronger side has the king in front of the pawn. In this video I'm going to go over the most important positions when the pawn is on the 7th rank and the rooks are in front of the pawn. First we're going to take a look at positions where the stronger side has the rook in front of its pawn on the 7th rank and has the move. So here, with white to play, white is easily winning. If the opponent's king is on the same rank as your pawn, meaning on the 7th rank, white is easily winning. The winning maneuver here is rook to h8. From here, black only has two replies. If the rook takes the pawn, then white can simply come with the rook to h7 check, and now the black king is forced to move away, probably will attack the rook, but now our rook will take the rook on a7 and then win the game from here. And coming back, if instead of taking the pawn with the rook, black will use the king to attack the rook on g7, here white will simply promote the pawn to a queen, and now black is forced to take it. After black takes the rook takes back, and white is up a rook and will easily win the game from here. In this next position, the opponent's king is not on the same rank as the pawn. However, if the opponent's king is out in the open, white can easily win by a simple check. So here, after rook to f8 check, white is easily winning. From here, black will probably attack the rook, let's say king to e7. And after this, white will simply promote to a queen. And now black will capture the queen and white will capture back. Being up a rook, again, white is easily winning. In this next position, after white moves the pawn to h7, white is going to try to check black's king to gain a tempo and then promote his pawn. But here, after black moves the king to b4, the pawn on b6 will act as a shelter to protect them from the check of the white rook. So how can white win here? Well, white is still winning because of the excellent move of pawn to c5. And now black has only a few options. First of all, if he takes the pawn on c5, now the pawn is not sheltering its king from the checks no more, so white can win with rook to b8 check. From this, the king will have to move away. He'll probably take the pawn on a4. White will promote the pawn, rook takes the queen, rook takes back, and now from here the win is pretty easy. White does have to be careful. Let's say pawn to c4, king to d1, king to b3, king to c1, pawn to a4, rook to b8 check, king to c3, and after king to b1, here black can try king to d2, from which white will attack both pawns on a4 and c4. After pawn to c3, here white has to be careful. Black will be able to move the pawn with check, so he doesn't want to let black do that. So he's going to come with the rook to d4 check. The king will move away, then we're going to capture the first pawn. After king to d2 back, we're going to check the king again, king to e3, rook behind the pawn, and after black attacks our rook, we could simply just move it back, and now after the pawn will move forward, we will be able to take that pawn as the king is there to protect the rook. And coming back here, if instead of moving the king to d2, black will try a3, the rook will simply stay on that file, let's say rook to b7. After king to d2, rook to a7, attacking the furthest advanced pawn, pawn to c3, rook d7 check, king to e2, now the king will move in front of c2, blocking the pawn on the c file from moving, and then the rook will simply come and capture the other pawn, and then the king will take the pawn on c3 and win the game from here. And coming back, after pawn to c5, if black is not going to take the pawn on c5, but he's going to try instead, let's say rook to h2, trying to check the king, eventually those checks will stop because the king will come f3, rook to h3 check, king to g4, and now the rook cannot check the king anymore. Here, the rook wants to stay behind the pawn on the 7th rank. If that rook moves away, for example, something like rook to b3, well, now white will simply move the rook away and it's going to promote the pawn on the next move. After something like rook to c3, the pawn will promote and white will easily win with the king and queen. Therefore, coming back, the rook cannot leave the h file, so he's probably just going to move back to rook to h1. After this, we will take the pawn on b6, and now after king takes a4, b7, the rook cannot prevent both pawns from promoting. We're simply going to promote the pawn and win the game from here. And now you might ask yourself, can black ever draw these type of positions? And the answer is yes. If the defending king is on the same rank as the pawn, meaning the 7th rank here, and he is on either the squares g7 or h7, he is able to draw these type of positions. And the reason for that is that none of the previous techniques will actually work here. After something like rook to h8, trying to come behind the king with check if black takes the pawn, this doesn't work anymore because the king being on g7 will simply capture the rook. And after we promote the pawn, the rook will capture back, and now black is the one easily winning. Coming back, also rook to g8 check doesn't work either because again, the black king can take the rook, and after we promote the pawn, the rook will capture it, and now black is the one winning again. And now the only other try that white has is trying to use the king to attack the rook to move it off the a file, but that's not going to be successful either. After something like king to c2, let's say king to h7, king to b2 attacking the rook will simply stay on the a file. He will move the rook to a6, king to b3, king to g7, king to b4, rook to a1, king to b3, rook to a6, king to b4, and again the rook, all he has to do is stay on the a file moving up and down, or the king can move between g7 and h7 and achieve a draw like that. In this next position, white has an extra pass pawn on the h file, but this is still a draw. If the opponent's king is on g7 or h7, white can have a pass pawn on the h file or the g file, and this game is still a draw. So let's see why this is a draw. After pawn to h5, the king could move to h7, pawn to h6. Here, black has to be careful. He doesn't want to take the pawn. If the black king does take the pawn, let's say king takes h6, well, now white is winning with the same technique, rook to h8 check. After the black king comes to g7 attacking the rook, white will promote, and after black captures, white captures back. Here white is winning. We've seen this position before. But here, instead of taking the pawn with the king, black can simply draw by keeping the rook on the a file. After something like rook to a2 check, the king can come to c3, rook to a3 check, king to b4, rook to a6, king to b5, rook to a1. King to b6, and this is an important part that you want to remember. As soon as the king touches the pawn on the 7th rank, you want to make sure that you check the king and you don't let him touch that pawn. So here we want to play rook to b1 check. After that, let's say the king moves to a6, rook to a6 check. King to b6, rook to b1 check. King to c6, we could go back behind the pawn. King to b7, rook to b1 check. Again, as soon as the white king touches the pawn, we have to check him to get a draw here. Let's say king to c6, rook to a1. What happens if we don't do that? Let's say after king to b6, we simply move the rook to a2 instead of checking the king. Well, now white has an extra tempo to move the rook away. So the rook will move to b8, and after rook to b2 check, the king will simply come towards the rook, so there will be no more checks. Rook to c2 check, king to d4, rook to d2 check. After white attacks the rook one more time, we can go behind the pawn, but it's too late. That pawn will push and promote, and now we'll have to sacrifice our rook, and being down a rook, we will lose this game. Coming back from the beginning, I also want to mention that white cannot make any progress even if he tries to use the king together with the pawn on the h file to move the black king away so he can promote the pawn. So after something like king to e3 here, let's say king to g7, king to f4, king to h7, king to g5, the rook on the a file can simply start checking the king. So rook to a5 check, king to f6, rook to a6 check, king to f7 sheltering from the checks, rook to a1, pawn to h6, rook to a6, king to e7. The rook just has to stay on the a file. Let's say rook to a2, king to d7, rook to a3, king to c7. Now here, black has to be super careful. He should stay on first, second, or third rank, and whenever the white king touches the pawn, he needs to check the king to move the king away from the pawn. If black here plays with the rook to a5, for example, this will be a terrible mistake, as now white can attack the rook on b6 and also defending the pawn. And black, being on the 5th rank, cannot come to b5 to check the king, as white will simply take the rook. So now he's forced to move back, giving white the extra tempo that he needs to move the rook away, because the king is defending the pawn. And from here we've seen how rook to b1, this doesn't save the game, and white will be able to promote the pawn and win the game from here. But coming back, if instead black just keeps the rook far away from the king, when the king touches the pawn, he just needs to check that king, moving it away and then going behind the pawn, and then this game will end up in a draw. With the pawn on the g file, the play is very similar. After the black king just blocks the pawn on the g file, black just needs to keep the rook behind the pawn on the a file, and whenever the white king touches the pawn, he wants to make sure that he checks the king, not letting him defend the pawn. So here black can simply move the rook to a1. After king to b2, just staying behind the pawn, that's all he needs to achieve a draw. And whenever the white king defends the pawn, he wants to make sure that he's going to check the king, not allowing the white king defend the pawn, giving the white the tempo to move the rook away. And after, like, king to a6, rook to a1 check, king to b6, rook to b6 check, the king moves away, and then we're just going to keep the rook behind the pawn and achieve a draw in the same manner. In this next position, white has a passed pawn on the f file, and this is a win for white. If the pawn is on the f file or the central files here, white will always be able to win. All he has to do is just launch that pawn on its own. So after something like f4, let's say king to h7, f5, king to g7, f6 check. Now here, if black takes the pawn, let's say king takes f6, well, white will be able to come to f8 with check, and we saw how white will win the game from here. Coming back, if black, instead of taking the pawn, will move the king to f7, blocking that pawn from moving, well, now white is able to move the rook to h8, and we saw that after black takes the pawn, white will come with the rook to h7 check. Black will have to move away, and then we could capture the rook and win the game from here. And coming back again, if black moves the king to h7 instead, well, that pawn will simply march forward. Pawn to f7, that pawn will become a queen in the next move, so rook will come behind it. After that, the pawn will promote, the rook will have to sacrifice, and after we take back, we can win the game from here. Next, we're going to take a look at a couple positions where black is able to draw, even though his king is out in the open. Here, if it was white to move, white can easily win just moving the rook to e8 check, and we saw after that he's going to be able to promote the pawn. But if it's black to move, black can draw here simply because of the weak position of the opponent's king. If the stronger side's king is on the 7th rank, the same rank as the pawn, and black can take the opposition, he is able to draw. So after king to f5 here, taking the opposition, black is still able to draw. After king to e7, king to e5, king to d7, king to d5, king to c7, king to c5. And now, as soon as the white king will defend the pawn on b7, black can simply start checking the king. So rook to b1 check. After this, king to c7, rook back to a1. King to b7, rook to b1 check. If the king is trying to come on the a file, let's say king to a6, we're going to come rook to a1 check. King to b7, rook to b1 check. King to c7, rook to a1, and white cannot make any progress. Next, I want to mention that if the stronger side king is not on the 7th rank, the same rank as the pawn, taking the opposition here doesn't help. So after king to d4, white will move the king to c6, king to c4, and now white can use this nice maneuver, rook to c8. After this, if black takes the pawn, white can simply move the king away to b6, attacking black's rook, but at the same time checking the black king on c4. So here black has to move the king away, after which white can take the rook and win the game from here. The same maneuver doesn't work here with the king on the 7th rank. After the rook moves to c8, black can take the pawn on a7, and now the white king has to retreat, but the only square that he has available is b8, and after the king moves to b8, black can simply come and defend his rook, and he's going to be able to save it. After the white's rook moves away, black can simply retreat his rook, and saving the rook, he can also save the game. Next, we're going to take a look at two positions where the defending side has the rook in front of the pawn on the 7th rank. So the rule is this: if the defending side can get the king to defend the rook before the opponent's king is able to attack the rook, then he's going to be able to draw. In this position, if it's white to move, white will be able to win this position and black will lose, just because after king to d5, white will shelter the black king from getting to the rook, and the white king will get there first. So after this, black will move the king to f6, king to d6, king to f5, king to c7, king to e6. After king to b7, the black rook is being attacked, so it's going to have to move away. And after it moves away, white will promote the pawn, from which black will sacrifice the rook, and white will be able to win it back and win the game from here. In this next position, with black to move here, this is a draw. After the black king moves the king to b5, taking the vertical opposition, white cannot prevent black from defending his rook first, therefore he's going to get a draw. So from here, white can probably move the rook to a2. After king to c6, king to c4, king to b7, black defends the rook and he is able to achieve a draw. If white tries rook to b2 check, black is very happy to just repeat the position coming to c6, after which white will return to a2, black will defend the rook again. And if white moves the king to b5, black will simply retreat the rook, let's say rook to e8, and then if white will promote, then black will simply take the rook. After white takes, the black king takes back, and this is a draw. And if instead of promoting the pawn, white moves the rook to a1 here, well then the king can go in front of the pawn, and we know that this is a draw, as we've talked in the previous video. In this last position, it's white to move, and you could see that black's king is closer to his rook than his opponent's king. However, black is not able to draw here just because white is defending his pawn from the side. If white's rook would be on a1, defending the pawn from behind, then black will be able to get a draw here. The correct play here is rook to e7, cutting off the black king from going towards the black rook. From here, if black is trying to attack the rook right away, let's say king to f4, white can simply move the king to e2, king to f5, king to d3, king to f6. The rook will simply move away again, king to e6, king to c4, king to d6, white move the king to b5, and again the black king cannot get towards the black rook as the white rook attacks the square c7, the white king attacks the square c6 and c5, and black cannot defend his rook. After something like king to e6, king to b6, king to f6, king to b7, the rook will have to move away, from which white will promote, and then the rook will sacrifice, white will win the rook and win the game from here. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.